Riley, how's it going? Sorry it took me a little while to get to this analysis, but I'm going to make this video a little bit longer for you and hopefully give you some stuff to work on and help you understand this. This is one of your first swings, and this one was pretty good. Um, when I talk about the geometry of the swing, you have a bunch of different angles that I use to kind of help explain what's going on or just kind of how the swing functions. So I have right here in red, there are two red lines. You have one on the club shaft. For club shaft plane, you have one kind of above the shoulders. You can see that those angles are pretty much the same, both 55 degrees. If I split that right in the middle of that and drew one right here, I'd have elbow plane. So you can see those are all matched up pretty good. Now, in the golf swing, your club shaft is going to shift from either and go either above the club shaft plane on the bottom, below the club shaft plane, on the elbow plane or above the elbow plane, or on the shoulder plane or above the shoulder plane. That's kind of the planes that the golf swing can travel on. And depending on your preferred shot shape, your tendencies and misses, being on one or the other is going to be more beneficial. In my opinion, I like to kind of take it back from this position and keep it on the club shaft plane from here to parallel. And you see you get a little bit inside of that. I think that's a combination of your elbow retracting a little bit and from the takeaway your left shoulder not turning down enough. But right here it's manageable. Like I said, this swing's pretty good. But because you're a little inside at this position, you keep it on the club shaft plane a little bit longer than most players do. Still not a bad position, not going to kill you, just kind of helping you describe here. And you can see when I talked about you shift from club shaft plane up onto elbow plane. In my opinion, I like to see swings go from this position and you start keeping your elbows closer together. And when you do, you actually shift up sooner to the elbow plane. And then on the downswing, you're going to basically split the difference between these two planes. So you're going to be somewhere in that area, kind of between elbow plane and shoulder plane, if that makes sense. And taking you through this swing here, you do a pretty good job. You kind of go above it, but then as your shoulders start to work vertical into the ball, and your pivot kind of stalls, that's where your right arm goes down the line. So if I remove these lines, basically the more vertical your shoulders work, the less you're going to rotate. The more horizontal your shoulders work, the more you're going to rotate. So when your shoulders are working vertical like this, it's going to be a more inside-out stall flipped pattern in which we're trying to get out of your swing. So we're trying to add some rotation. Well, if you want to add some rotation, we need to get your hands a little bit more over your right shoulder, not so deep. Your right elbow is kind of retracted. I'd like to keep your elbows together sooner or your right elbow more in front of you, as we talked about. So that's kind of explaining that. If I show you real quick the geometry, or someone who does, has a pretty symmetrical swing, or the geometry is pretty close to what I like to see, just to kind of give you a reference point and show you a comparison. I think I mentioned him to you, but not saying you have to swing like this guy, but he does an okay job at it. Pull your swing up here. So here's your two swings. Spieth on the right, you on the left. Zoom this in a little bit. Get these guys kind of closer. If I draw those same lines we just talked about, club shaft plane, somewhere in that area, 53, you can see here, he's going to turn in the takeaway, camera shifts a little bit, but you can see his club shaft works right up that, and his elbow is more what I was talking about in front of his seam here. I'll even draw it in yellow. So his elbow is in front of his seam right here. Whereas if we take you at that same position, to me it looks like at this position right here, pretty similar. You can already see that your club head's behind your hands over here. His is kind of over his right forearm, where yours is actually behind your right forearm. And that's because I think that your elbow gets a little too deep behind you. If you can see, that's hard. You wore black and there's shadows, but you can really see what I was talking about, how Spieth's elbow stays above actually the club shaft plane. That's another way to look at it too. So if we come into here with these two lines, I'd want your elbow to be somewhere in this plane lane. And to me, it looks like you get a little bit behind it there and a little bit underneath of it instead of on top of it. Another thing to note too, look how much straighter his right arm is. That's another way to keep it in front of you. If you retract it, it's going to get more behind you and some things are going to happen. But as I mentioned at the top of the backswing, clear some of these other lines, I'd like to get your hands a little bit higher where Spieth's are. Tons of players are here. Your hands getting higher is just going to give you more time to get down to the ball. And as I mentioned here, I think it's crucial for most players to get their left arm pretty close to shoulder plane, or even slightly above it, like Spieth is here. So if you get it above it, it's just going to tend to go more out in the downswing. So as he rotates, his left arm is going to go out, meaning it's working more in this fashion, not staying back in here on an angle, which is going to allow him to keep pivoting and not have to stall and wait for his arms to catch back up. So if we could get your hands a little bit higher here, some of that is the position of your right elbow, but another thing, it's the position of your right elbow, it's the flexion, so how many degrees it's bent from 0 to 90, no more than 90, but then also the orientation. Remember how I was having you set up with your right elbow a little bit more turned in towards the target, where it was more like matching the club shaft plane? What I meant by that is more like your elbow was more tucked in here and matching the angle of that club shaft plane. That's another way to do it. Kind of hard to talk about in a video, but if you watch Spieth here, as we were talking about, and how much he rotates, and look where his right elbow is at impact, and we take you to impact. See how his right elbow is more on his side, whereas you have some space there? It's that way because he's kept it in front of him so he can actually keep it flexed and on his body as he pivots. If yours moves in the manner it does, it's behind you, so it's constantly having to try to get back in front, and it just can't do it. If you got your hands up a little bit higher, the elbow and arms would accelerate faster, and it would allow you to get your right elbow back in front of your right hip. And as he comes through, one of the things I look for too in a kind of an on-plane swing is if it's matched up well. Typically, that's a shoulder plane somewhere close to there. Again, these are approximations. And say his hands are exiting about right there. In the through swing, typically what you see is someone who's matched up, they're going to match up pretty well through the shot. His club's going to exit roughly the same angle, and you can see his right arm is over here, and that club is pretty much, it's a little bit more left, but it's pretty much the same angle as it was at the top of the backswing. If we take yours to the top, and your hands are over here, and your club is over there, not a bad position, like I said, from when we started, it's a pretty good position. You can see that your hands exit a lot higher, and your right arm is actually a little bit more vertical than your shoulder plane here. So just some of the things to say matchup. So if we're trying to eliminate one side of the golf course, or try to hit cuts, or be a little more consistent, less stalled, we got to have more rotation in the downswing, starting with the left knee, getting outside the left hip, as we talked about with the pivot with the basketball drill. But then also to get there, it's not just changing the pivot, it's also changing where the backswing goes. So getting your hands a little bit higher, and then actually making your club exit a little bit more left. So I'm going to pause it and switch angles for you, and then we'll talk about that side. Alright, so Riley, here we go. We got face-on caddy view of, this is again one of your first swings, and just still going over what we talked about here. Pivot's looking a lot better here, so you get a lot more turn or coil over your right leg, not so much bump to the left. You coil up pretty well. If I take Spieth over here on the right to the top, you can see he's a little bit more coiled over the instep. Everything's a little bit more over his inside, kind of much like you are. Camera angles are a little bit different, but pretty close there. Here's where the big difference is, kind of what we're talking about, is the sequencing of the downswing. Watch Spieth here. he's going to, if I draw a line right here where his left knee and left hip are perfectly 90 degrees, and I play this forward here, you can see that they've kind of moved there, but his left knee always kind of leads the parade. If I draw that same line there, 90 degrees, you can see that his left hip is actually a little bit behind his left knee. It would be a little bit more if he flared his foot. He keeps his left foot straight, so it's kind of an optical illusion, but his left knee is definitely in front of his left hip. And he's got quite a bit of space between his legs coming down here. So left arm parallel in the or in the downswing, he's got quite a bit of space there. So that means the space meaning he's continuing to rotate. He's shifting his pressure, has a little bit of weight transfer towards the target, but he's not just sliding. He's doing it primarily by rotation. And you do a pretty good job of this. But as we start to get down here at left arm parallel, to me it looks like your left hip is actually in front still of your left knee, and your knees are a lot closer together. If I go down one more frame to club shaft parallel, your knees are almost touching, your left leg is getting pretty close to straight. If I take Spieth down to that same position, he still has curvature in his left leg, if you can see that. It's not straight up and down. He's got curvature in this leg there, which means he's still turning. He's not, he's still maintaining flexion, which he's turning. He's just slowing the rate at which he's turning. He's not snapping his lower body or snapping his left leg in terms to try to get his hips to fire because he's stuck. And typically I see what in the position you're at, a straight left leg, right elbow is behind the right hip. Here you can see in the picture, we can see the wall behind you, whereas if you look at Spieth here on the right, right elbow's back in front of the right hip. And you can also see a checkpoint I like to look at is when club shaft's basically parallel to the ground at this point, the left arm should be basically right on the right leg. And yours is just slightly trailing behind you. Not a bad thing, but if you're trying to clean up misses and stop a flip, I'd like to see the hands get a little bit more in front of the body and the right elbow more in front of the hip and more rotation, less kind of stall flip with the lower body. But again, some of it comes from where the backswing is. So if our hands aren't tall enough or in the right position, I can't rotate correctly to get in the position that Jordan Spieth is. As we saw from the other camera angle, Spieth's left arm was more on his shoulder plane. His hands were higher, giving him more time to get his right elbow and hands back in front. Another thing though, the hands and arms don't really have to get back in front if they don't ever really get behind you. So I like to think of it as the right elbow is really never going behind the seam of your shirt, or if you split your side right down the middle, your right elbow would not retract behind that. If you can do that and turn your left shoulders, maintain your shoulder plane, all the stuff we talked about from the other angle, odds are you're probably going to get in a pretty good position. And then from there, pivot with the left knee starting the downswing, keeping the space between the knees as long as possible, and then when you get an impact, you try to close that gap pretty quick. That's where you get the late speed, but you have really a lot of stable face control there. I want to show you a couple of the drills we had here just to kind of go over some of the swings where it progressed. Like I said, this was one of the first swings. We had some pretty good ones on the once we started doing some drills. For example, this swing right here, I kind of caught you going back a little bit. One of the things is that ball between your arms here keeps your right arm a lot straighter, and you get in a lot better position. You have more width, meaning there's more space between your head and the club shaft, or your body and the club shaft. But this was a pretty good swing here. If you notice how your pivot here, when you swing through at this position, your left arm is not quite on your right elbow, but your leg has a little bit more flex coming through it. It's not so snapped. You have some shaft lean coming through, and your left knee even has a little bit of flex going through the shot, which is good. A different position that you're in. So that was when we just took the ball, stuck it between your elbows, tried to keep your arms a little bit more in front of you. This got you a little more width, not so narrow. Narrow meaning not necessarily the distance your hands are, but primarily just the angle that the club shaft is, less set. Less less wrist cock or wrist hinge going up. But I think we really started to, so just kind of some of the drills. We talked about shoulder plane in this one. This one I think even had the ball. Lost some of the light here, but this one I think you had the ball. No, I don't know if the ball's in there. But this one you just did shoulder plane. And as you can see, when I try to do this drill, this is when we've had the shaft adapter thing right there. I want your shoulder plane to be pretty close to this line right there. And you can see you're just a hair fraction under it, but pretty good. I mean, I'm just splitting hairs there, but your hands are starting to get above your head, which is good. When we first started, you were down here way too deep and your hands were really low, for my preferences. And for the shot shapes that you were seeing in the misses, I think that getting them higher is going to help you. Towards the end here, another drill we did with that same stick, but just took the longer shaft out, was just put an object in front of you, just on the outside part of your hands, to show that you're trying to pivot and get the club to exit left. So still, this one looks like you had a glove between your, you might even have the basket between your legs. No, this one you didn't. You had a glove underneath. But as you see here, when you come down, pretty good here, and as you rotate through the shot, your right arm is starting to exit a little bit more left. So if I draw the angle that your hands are at the top there, shaft somewhere over here, if we zoom in here so you can see that, where we're looking, go all the way. As you come through, exiting a lot more on plane, your right arm's now matching your shoulder plane. So just giving yourself the feedback, understanding the sequence. So you have drills where you're just trying to make the movements to get into positions that are going to allow you to then add dynamic speed to it. So those were the positions, were some of those drills where I had you put your left arm underneath your right elbow and kind of take the club to the top and then grab it with your left arm and see where your left arm is in relation to your shoulder plane. That's a great feeling, trying to match that shoulder plane and left arm at the top. Taking the butt end of the club, gripping it, going to the top of your backswing and kind of stretching against the wall. That's another good drill. But all in all, we have to get your hands a little bit more up, a little bit above your head, less deep, right elbow more in front of you in the backswing. So ways to feel that are possibly maybe slightly straighter right arm. Maybe your right elbow or right forearm is a little bit more supinated up, where your right elbow is more pointing at the target. That's kind of what supination just means, that if you look at your wrist, it's facing up, and pronation is basically facing down. So pronation would be like push-up position if you're with your hand. Your elbow would be in kind of a pronated position. And if you're holding a tray on your palm of your hand, that would be supination. So your right arm is more rotated up. So that's the position you want to get your elbow in, the holding the tray position. It's called external rotation. That's a good position to get in for what you're trying to accomplish. But let me see here. Where did I go? If I go to Spieth here, down the line again, I really just think he's got a simple golf swing a lot. There's some things about it that are kind of quirky, but as I mentioned, he is going to keep his right elbow pretty much right in front of that line that I just drew there. It's going to look like it gets behind it, but it doesn't because his body's pivoting. So he's turning his chest. So the seam of his shirt is now over here. As he continues to rotate, the seam of the shirt is getting more behind him as he rotates. It's hard to tell that in two-dimensional video, but his right elbow is definitely more in front of him. And as he rotates, doesn't have to change anything. That club shaft is above his right arm. Now he's bang on as he comes into impact. He's got open hips and open shoulders. And as he exits, club head's over here, right arm's already going to disappear behind the body. All that happens not because he just pivoted, but because the club was in a better position at the top and he was able to pivot from there. So take a look at this, bud. Like I said, I gave you a little bit longer analysis here, tried to explain some of the concepts that we talked about, but I think you're making the progress here. If we can get that backswing in a better position, get your left knee a little bit more outside your left foot, starting the downswing pivot, and then from there just working on it to get the sequencing down for the desired ball flight you're trying to hit. I think you'll be going in the right direction. So if you have any questions, bud, let me know, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.